All right, without further ado, we have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started. I know there's people that continue to trickle into the webinar here. We appreciate your interest and your participation. We'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of Erika Meldrim and myself. We are both colleagues at Innosight, which is a strategy and innovation consulting firm that I co-founded with Professor Clay Christensen in 2000. Just saying this one more time for those that just joined, this webinar is being recorded. We want to make sure you know that all participant lines have been muted, but feel free to submit questions as we go along if you have them in the chat feature and to comment as well. So let's get started. You'll see on the next slide, it's pretty much everything that I just said procedurally. We just want to make sure that everybody's aware of the recording, and as you can see there, that the link to the recording and the slides will be shared. So that's a bit of housekeeping. Just moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned, I co-founded Innosight with Clay Christensen in 2000. So been 21 years, since the innovator's dilemma, was started in 1997, and we co-founded the firm. It was really focused on how do you manage disruptive growth. Well, a big insight of what was really driving disruptive technologies and innovation was the disruption was in the business model, and that led to work that started in the mid 2000s and led to the first book, Seizing the White Space, and then the updated version, Reinvent Your Business Model, that you see here, that was published in 2018, really on how do you begin to think about what is a business model, the circumstances for it, and the process to actually create a new business model. And that's sort of the focus of the webinar. But I also wanted to just mention the new book that we've co-authored and presented, that's been published about a year ago, called Lead from the Future. And the reason I mention that is we have found over the 20 years plus that in order to achieve business model innovation, to achieve breakthrough growth, there's this important linkage of innovation with vision and strategy, and long-term vision and strategy, because of the nature of business model innovation being about incubation and then scale. You have to have a longer time horizon. You have to have a reason in many ways for why you're thinking strategically about going into places, new market opportunities where business models and business model innovation are going to be relevant. So we won't talk about Lead from the Future, but we just recommend that these things tie together. Just as strategy to innovation tie together, we need to think about both. And that's what Innosight has been about, is really trying to help companies be forward-looking, to be able to navigate disruptive change and be able to own their future. If we move to the next slide, I want to just share one quick story. We've packed a lot in here, so I'll tee it up because we're going to come back to it. But it's about what I wrote in Reinvent Your Business Model about Lockheed Martin and its invention, its innovation called the hybrid airship, which came out of their, sort of advanced innovation prototyping group that's within their aeronautics division called Skunk Works. And they came up in the mid 2000s with what they call this hybrid airship, but it's called hybrid airship in that it's a hybrid between an airplane or an airfoil and an actual lighter than air airship. And it was an amazing innovation in that you could take off and land in very short spaces. So it's really good for like mining companies and places with poor infrastructure. And tied to that was it could carry a lot of payload, way more than a vertical lift, a helicopter or short take off and landing aircraft. And so it had this amazing opportunity. It was originally intended for defense, but when companies and industries caught wind of its invention, they were just knocking down the doorstep of Lockheed Martin to be able to come up with, hey, is there an opportunity that we could have a commercial application of this? And as we'll talk about, Lockheed Martin really struggled to figure out how to deploy this innovation into commercial markets, because as the chairman of Lockheed Martin once said about defense, about Lockheed Martin, our history is unblemished by any success with any kind of innovation in the commercial world. Well, I'm here to tell you the underpinning of that failure was not because they weren't able to come up with the right idea or innovate the product or service to the marketplace or the marketing. It was they didn't have overall a business model that was appropriate for the commercial markets. They had a business model for defense. So that's what we wanted to talk about, is how do you understand what a business model is, the circumstances for it in the process, so that you can overcome the challenges that Lockheed Martin Skunk Works overcome, which, by the way, in recent years they have, but it took them a while because they didn't have a language, they didn't have a lens called business model and business model innovation to understand what was really holding them back. And if you go to the next slide, that kind of gets us to the challenge that companies have, which is, there's more data than ever about customers, there's really greater understanding of markets, yet innovation rates remain dismally low. 84% of executives say innovation is important, but 94% are dissatisfied with their performance. And I believe they're not saying this about day-to-day innovation, product improvement, marketing, and all that kind of thing. They're talking about breakthrough innovation. And it kind of goes back to the same thing I said. One is strategy, one is having vision, but the other is not having a good language that many times breakthrough growth and innovation is going to come not just with the product and service change, but with the business model change. So that's what we really want to kind of help, again, try to overcome these abysmal percentages. So Erika, maybe you can launch us with one survey we'd like you all to quickly take.
Great, thanks, Mark. So we'd like to switch gears here to our first interactive activity. It's great that folks are joining from around the world here. We're going to use an interface called Slido. So please go to slido.com on your phone, your tablet, or your desktop browser, or you can also scan the QR code here with your phone and just type BMI after the hashtag. And what we'd love for you to do is just reflect on the greatest obstacles to business model innovation within your organization. So take a minute or so, think about this, submit the obstacles that come to mind in Slido in 3 words or less. You can submit as many obstacles as you'd like. And if you see a word or phrase on the screen that'll pop up in just a moment that resonates with you, please submit it and resubmit it for emphasis. So we'll give folks a few seconds to add some thoughts here. Again, what are the biggest obstacles to business model innovation within your organization? So this is great. We see a couple of things here around culture, risk aversion, a couple cultural pieces, resource allocation, to Mark's recent point here, lack of vision.
Yeah, this is a good list.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things, which kind of gets at a point that so much about really being able to drive breakthrough change or growth, transformation, business model innovation is it's a system challenge, which is why, again, it makes it so hard. And these are really, a lot of these are the elements. The system is both comprised of the organizational processes, but it's also in the nature of human beings, like somebody mentioned, complacency. So these all sort of factor in to, it's not only about the economics, it's about the organizational behavior piece, it's about process, it's about ideas, it all sort of has to come together. And we're going to hopefully cover an important piece of this, which is you also need this language of business models and knowing when you need to innovate them and how you go about doing that. So maybe we should move on just for the sake of time. This is really helpful and good to see everybody's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's head back to the presentation here. So I'm happy to tee up this next section. And the idea here is we'll cover the contours of business model innovation along a few dimensions. So we'll share a perspective on the definition and construct of a business model, featuring what we call the 4-box framework. We'll also touch on circumstances for business model change when we're repositioning the core today and really creating the new for tomorrow. And lastly, we'll walk through some of the high tent poles of the process for designing and developing a new business model that is really squarely anchored around deep customer understanding. So I'll pass it back over to you, Mark.
Great. Well, let's just dive right into the first section here. What is a business model? I'll just caveat that, again, we're really just trying to give a kind of a taste of the language here that, again, is so important. we won't be able to do a deep dive per se, but we're trying to just kind of give you all a set of lenses by which we can, save 15 minutes or so for, to kind of answer your questions. And again, please keep filling in comments or questions in the chat. So just to kind of get at the essence for those that haven't seen this framework or haven't seen any business model framework for that matter, we want to start with the fundamentals. And let's get at the core definition, what a business really model is. It's a representation. It's not a real thing. It's a framework that helps organize thoughts and assumptions to be able to manage the innovation process as it relates to not just changing the product, but changing the nature of how resources and processes come together, how the overall organization needs to work. Succinctly said, a business model is a representation of how an organization creates, that's the customer value proposition, creates value, how it, for the customer, how it captures value for itself, that's the profit formula and its core mission. That's how it's achieving the value that which it is capturing based on providing value for the customer. That's the lower right-hand block. And then the left hand is how does it repeatedly deliver that value to the customer while capturing it repeatedly for itself. So it's about creating, capturing, and delivering value and having a representation of how that system works to do that, with an added piece of making sure, just like anything, an organization becomes sustainable in that scale of what it does. So the circle you see there of rules, norms, and metric overlay this 4-box model to allow for a business model to repeatably, once it's up at scale, to repeatably deliver that that value to many customers while capturing value in a full-scale balance sheet income statement, and then having the resources, processes, the activity system to do that. That is what we need to think about, and we need to think about it as a system. I'm just going to walk briefly through each of them just to go a little bit deeper. If you want to really absorb this, I'd recommend getting the book Reinvent Your Business Model, being able to, because language we have found is so important. Many companies will talk about business model and business model innovation, but people have different definitions of what it is. If they were to describe their own business model, they might have a different way to talk about it. So let's just quickly go on the first, which is on the next slide. If you go to customer value proposition, there's really two parts of this. Well, one, of course, is you have to understand what the need is or the job the customer is going to need to get done. We're going to talk about that. Once you understand that, then you need to propose value for that job or that need that the customer is trying to accomplish. And that comes through the offering. What is the offering, both product and service? As it says here, to accomplish the job that's being addressed. But it's not just about the product and service, it's also how it's delivered, the access, the distribution. What's the means by which the customer receives this value, and that in itself kind of helps derive value for those that are involved. And then a payment scheme is, how is it paid for? Is it one time? Is it subscription? So forth. Those all encapsulate customer value proposition, and we need to think about those as the more those deliver on an important unmet need or job, the more powerful the value proposition. If we go to the next slide. Everything follows from that job and that customer value proposition. We'll talk about whether you develop the profit formula next or the key resources and processes, but just to move along, profit formulas is as it sounds. It's really the defined income statement and balance sheet of an organization's business unit and how it is repeatedly delivering value. There's a revenue model piece. Of course, there's the cost structure. There's the unit margins, but then there's, even when this ties to the balance sheet, there's resource velocity. Some make money by selling a few things at very high margins that are big ticket items. Others sell with very high resource velocity, meaning how fast resources are being consumed and driven through the system, to do things at scale. So that's the profit formula. And then finally, as it sounds, key resources and processes. These are the more tangible things. The resources are very tangible: people, technology, equipment, and so forth. Processes are tangible as well, but they're a little less flexible. These is design, product development, so forth. This is an easy list, and it's not so much about like having a hey, these are the things that are key resources and processes. The bigger issue is, how do these interact together? How do they form their interdependencies into an activity system, as Michael Porter would talk about at the Harvard Business School, a famous strategist. How do they come together to be able to repeatably deliver for the value proposition of the customer and the profit formula? So that, in a nutshell, is what is a business model. And we have to, in our view, frame up these four major pieces to be able to understand our existing business model, how a new one might be needed based on the value proposition that needs to get developed. So just to put this, just sort of as a quick reference, let's go to the next slide. I just use the example of healthcare device maker Medtronic, who had a very well-established pacemaker business in the United States, but then they came up with a ability to deliver pacemakers to the emerging middle class in India. And what they needed to do was move to solutions, as you can see here, a value proposition that cardiac disease is now made accessible through new channels. So the distribution piece became really important, and affordability through product innovation, and creating third-party financing with help from the government of India. The profit formula changed from its high-end pacemaker business in the United States to create reduced margins at higher volumes to be able to make money in a different way and have a concurrent reduction in cost structure to make that happen. Processes, they needed a depth of experience just in general in marketing pacemakers worldwide that would help them in how they were going to think about this, specific to India, which actually they had been in for other reasons in India for a very long time. And of course, with that, the resources, strong relationships with the Indian medical community and partnerships with these third-party financiers. This is a very quick flyby of just how you could begin to start talking the language, whether it's your existing business model, or in this case, Medtronic coming up with a really new disruptive business model to be better positioned for how it's going to, deliver its pacemakers to a market that it had never delivered before, but yet with just a great need to be able to help them. So that's the first section, what is a business model? I'm just going to quickly talk about the second section before I turn it over to Erika on circumstances. And maybe it won't be that quick. There's a lot to cover, but I think this is a very important section to understand, which is, it's never should be business model for business model innovation's sake. It's always about, what is it that we're trying to accomplish as a job to be done, and the value proposition changing, and then what does that mean for fundamental business model shifts? That being said, we like to think about just a commonality of where business model innovation, is a prerequisite where it's needed. And I think you could think about it as a established organization in sort of two major buckets. When is it needed to reposition today? Meaning reposition the core, where the core needs reinvention. And we find two basic circumstances for that. One is in the convenience economy and the customization that we see happening in many companies, where the basis of competition is shifting from product functionality to convenience and accessibility and making things simple. And I'll give an example of that. Or commoditization is in full thrust, and the company wants to position to be able to address competition at the low end and make something what we would call affordable innovation, being able to address low cost and being able to do things by changing the cost structure and addressing the low end, if you will. Those are the two circumstances within repositioning today. The other reason for business model innovation, which is probably more common and understood, is when you're trying to go after the white space beyond the core in adjacencies of your organization and compete in non-traditional markets. That's the example of Medtronic going into emerging markets, going into a new market, actually, in this case, and being able to take what it's done in established markets and be able to be competitive in the emerging markets and reach a group of people that it hadn't reached before. So that's the framework of circumstances. Now I'll walk you through just quickly convenience, affordability, and then the right-hand side, new markets. On convenience, again, I wrote about this in Reinvent Your Business Model. I want to use the example of the tools maker in Liechtenstein in Europe that called Hilti, and how Hilti was a manufacturer of small power tools that it provided to consumers, but it also provided to construction sites. Now, there was an interesting challenge that happened with what Hilti was facing. They were a premium brand, and they were facing commoditization by Chinese tools makers in particular. But they turned to their customers, especially on construction sites, and they really had a deep understanding, of some of their needs. And they realized that there was a problem that many of them had, which is that these power tools, even Hilti premium power tools, were being treated as consumables. They were left in the rain, parts were missing. They were not able to get access to these power tools when they needed them. And, even though in aggregate, they might be only like 10,000 US dollars compared to the millions of dollars of other construction equipment like Caterpillar tractors, every time one of these small little power tools wasn't available to do a job, it could affect on-site productivity, that the whole job site would have to shut down. So long story short is they positioned on a different job to be done. Instead of it being about provide me a power tool to be able to make this whole, it became a much more ambitious job to be done, or mission, called help me finish the job, help me be more productive. And what they came up with, what they called basically is Hilti's fleet management service, which was a subscription-based offering where basically if a tool broke down, Hilti would, first of all, they would own all the assets and they would provide a subscription for the tools. So no longer do the construction sites own the tools, they're more basically subscribing to a service. And as soon as a tool was broken, Hilti would replace it. If a tool was lost, they would come up and replace that. So they were able to become basically the ability to manage this, help me finish the job, by creating a service to be able to have tools at the right place at the right time. And it became, as you can see, going from selling power tools and accessories to basically fleet management to improve on-site productivity. The customer was no longer just an individual construction worker. The customer was now the CEO of these construction sites, because you were selling a long-term full program of power tools as a service that were being managed, inventory, everything else. And that's where you see also the profit formula change from low margin to subscription model. Activity system went from just retail distribution to now direct sales. They needed an IT system to manage inventory. Contract management became really important. You can see the distinction from the left and the right side of how different the business model had to change in order to compete on convenience. It wasn't that they were making better tools. They were just changing the base of competition to focus on convenience. And this was creating a service, and it was able to transform the organization. And oh, by the way, this was a case where huge success with this business model. It was accretive to the existing one, meaning that the margins actually improved by being able to create this service. So that, in a nutshell, is the first circumstance, competing on convenience. The second one is competing on affordability. And if you go to the next slide, I have another defense example. In the world of defense, there has been a move called literally affordable innovation to be able to manage a lot of different contracts, for defense application at a much lower cost. And you can see this, I have here, low cost unmanned aerial vehicles, ground vehicles, small unmanned ground vehicles, that's the lower left. Boeing's TX program, which is now the T7 trainer, joint munitions on the top. There's just a bunch of different things. And basically they had to change the cost structure. They had to change the way they thought about requirements, that everything wouldn't have to be top notch. They had to actually design for affordability, which was a different paradigm shift and really fundamentally changed the business model, again, to be able to compete on cost as opposed to differentiation, something that the defense market and prime contractors were not very familiar with. If you go to the next slide, again, I won't be able to go in detail, but there's another article here in the Harvard Business Review called New Business Models in Emerging Markets, which further gets into this discussion. But basically, you can walk clockwise or counterclockwise around the four-box business model. Meaning, if you're competing on trying to make something low cost, like the defense market, or like, just trying to reach the low end, with a different cost structure, you start with the job and the value proposition, but you go clockwise, or in terms of, you need to then say, what's the cost structure I need, based on the price that I need to sell to the customer to be cost competitive. And so you build your profit formula design-wise to have a cost structure that fits the anticipated pricing and margin that you need. And then you develop the activity system or these key resources and processes to support it. If you're going for differentiation, a little bit more like Hilti, the value proposition and the associated price as it is to be able to deliver that service through the subscription, then what do we need for resources and processes to support it? And then based on what we need for processes and resources, what's the profit formula that's I'm going to have that it's going to default to a cost structure, into a margin set, and support the price to be able to do it. So that's where business model change comes in, not only in general, but kind of how you walk from value proposition to profit formula or to activity system. So that's what I'll just say on affordable innovation as part of potentially transforming the core. The last circumstance to share before I turn it over to Erika is competing on non-traditional markets or creating new markets. They're kind of a little bit overlapping or one and the same. And, I'm going to go back to the Skunkworks example. So I mentioned about the hybrid airship. The challenge was, the innovation was exciting and they literally had commercial customers knocking on their door, but they just couldn't figure out, they literally couldn't compute how to actually sell this airship to, and make money and do it, until recently. It took a long time, 2005 to 2015, almost nothing happened because of this challenge. And, you can dissect it almost like an engineer if you go to the next slide and you compare Lockheed Martin's aeronautics division, which was basically the group that oversaw Lockheed Martin Skunkworks. So Skunkworks did everything in service to aeronautics, that were the makers of the F-22 and the F-35, these fighter jets. Customer value proposition, government customer, that's all they knew. Competing on superior performance, sustaining improvements, profit formula, government accounting. The activity system, it's about large scale, complex programs in cutting edge engineering, manufacturing, and program management, like they always do with a government customer. What hybrid airship really needed to be able to serve mining companies that they never served before. These are commercial customers that have a completely different way you have to think about in terms of the nature of that customer interaction. This is going to be not just about superior performance, but it's going to have to be cost-effective access. And you're going to have to do direct delivery of these goods. It's not going to just be to a, singular customer called the US government. The accounting is going to be completely different to commercial accountings, which they never had any familiarity with. And as you can see on key resources and processes, not to say that there wasn't a program management piece and some of the things on the left, but they would have to get good big time in commercial logistics and capital investment and sales and marketing and supply chain management, things that they just didn't have a process. They never installed a process to be able to do that, let alone how these processes would need to interact as in a, commercial type business model. And, in recent days, they've actually partnered with a company that has this business model as opposed to building it themselves, but they struggled to make that happen. So that just kind of gives you the idea, the circumstance of really going into a whole new market, whether it's an emerging market or a defense contractor going into a commercial market. That creation of a new market requires a completely fundamental change in business models. And that has to take place by being able to think about, what's needed here. So last but not least, before I turn it over to Erika, I just want to mention just one point, and this mainly goes into the new market side, which is digital transformation is the big buzzword. today everybody's talking about digital and how your company needs to transform. And oftentimes it's tied to, oh, that means new business models. And oftentimes it does, but they're not one and the same. A digital transformation, in our view, enables companies to extract and create value in three ways, two of which don't really have anything to do, or potentially don't have anything to do, with business model innovation. One, on the bottom, digitizing core processes. It's about using digital to lower costs and increase efficiency of existing processes to be able to lower costs and be more efficient. On the upper left, digitize external stakeholder interfaces. That means improving the customer experience. And that's by using digital to create a better end-to-end stakeholder experience through connectivity and automation. That doesn't necessarily either involve business model innovation, but it's important to deploy digital for how it does enhance the customer experience. And then the third, where business model innovation does apply, is on the right, to discover and scale digital businesses, whether those are content businesses or whether those are platform businesses, content like Netflix or platform like Airbnb. That's acting as a producer to offer the digital product or a platform, as I said. That is where business model innovation and digital definitely overlap. And we do want to be clear that oftentimes the ability to unleash digital transformation, to be able to take advantage of digital, especially in this point about new markets, requires an understanding that digital alone is not going to do it, that digital is the enabler. It's like the catalyst or fuel to be able to spark a new business model that can create beyond the core growth in a different way. But again, I won't have a lot of time to be able to share other than this idea, but just if I could plan in your minds that digital transformation and business model innovation are not the same thing, we have to understand the circumstance where it applies. And with that, Erika, I'll turn it over to you for the last section.
Great, thanks, Mark. So as we head into this last section, with the first two sections as a baseline, we want to conclude with the process for designing and developing new business models. So how do you really create an enduring capability within your organization to drive really transformational innovation and growth? So with that, we will help set the stage with another interactive poll. This one is pretty straightforward. Again, we'll use Slido. So you can go to slido.com, again, on your phone, tablet, or desktop browser, and enter the hashtag BMI and reflect on this question. Do you have a defined process for developing new business models in your organization? Is that a yes or a no? So we will see what folks enter here. Again, slido.com, and you can enter BMI and answer yes or no. And what I'm seeing so far is what we typically see, is that by large part, that defined and disciplined way of going about business model innovation is not really present. There might be components. So you're all in good company here, and this is a good segue to kind of the last section of the webinar here. So we will head back to the main presentation. Now, when we think about the process for business model innovation, the first thing that we wanted to tee up here is when we work with clients across industries, again, over the past 20 years, we've really extracted patterns and principles and designed a structured way to approach business model innovation. So instead of relying on intuition, right, or luck to unlock growth, you can really make it more predictable and repeatable. So there are really three basic steps. The first step doesn't involve business model innovation thinking at all, actually. It starts with the opportunity to satisfy an important unmet customer job to be done. We'll dive into the idea of jobs to be done in a minute, but it's the problem a customer is trying to solve in a particular circumstance. And we just believe it's imperative that you start here and you anchor the business model around the customer. The second step is creating a blueprint that really lays out how your company aims to fulfill that job at a profit. So this is where the 4-box business model framework comes in that Mark just reviewed, along with elements of ideation that ensure you're really thinking expansively enough about the 4 boxes for the most compelling result. The third step is what we call test and learn. The notion here is you should invest a little to learn a lot. So once you've detailed the business model blueprint, what are the prioritized set of key underlying assumptions, and how can you efficiently test and validate these assumptions? So we believe an emergent strategy from business model to scale is critical for ultimate success and for growth. So that's sort of the three-step process. Just to pause for a moment on this notion of jobs to be done, because we feel it's so central to business model innovation. Again, as Harvard Business School professor Ted Levitt once said, people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And indeed, that's true. We like to say that customers don't buy products and services, but they hire them to get certain jobs done in their lives. And business model design starts with the identification of that important, unsatisfied, and widely held customer job, which really helps to signal market opportunity. If you think about this again within your organization and what we find across companies, when searching for the jobs to be done, you shouldn't only think about the functional job, but also about emotional and social jobs. And we find that thinking about all three is very important to unlock opportunity. So a functional job describes how the consumer achieves a functional goal. So here in this example with Uber, it's get from where I am to where I want to go. So that's pretty basic. If you go to the emotional job, an emotional job describes how the consumer feels or wants to feel. In this case, if you think of Uber again, it might be feel like I have a private driver, especially if you're in a luxury vehicle, for example. And then if you think about the social job here is about perception, how the consumer wants to be perceived by others. So again, here for Uber, it might be show that I'm part of the digital generation because you have fluidity with using the app, for example. So the key message here is the job is critical, and thinking about this along three dimensions is just as important. So we'll round out with a few other points here and then move quickly to Q&A, so Mark and I can field some more questions here as well. But business model innovation is truly about integrating the right business model behind the job. The job is the root of your customer value proposition. That's the customer-focused piece of the business model. And then you go ahead and build an effective delivery system of key resources and key processes and the profit formula. And that is the company-focused aspect of the business model. So again, a systems view, but without the anchor of the job to be done, you really don't have a solid starting point. Organizations often ask us the question about, what is the most effective way to articulate the business model on a page during the design phase? And so we wanted to share this with everyone. This is a tool that we recommend that is quite effective. It's called a business model canvas, and it provides a simple yet comprehensive way to outline the value proposition, the operating model or the resources and processes, and then the profit formula, along with an important category here around risks and assumptions. Of course, there are pages behind this that detail the business plan in more granularity, but this is really a helpful executive summary that we've used across organizations. And the last bit here, one of the things we've also run into time and again is this idea of, or this question, I should say, of how do I get my organization or my teams to think expansively about business model innovation, particularly when we're very used to just focusing on core or adjacencies versus transformational growth. And we use this concept called business model levers, which is very effective. And the idea here is, let's take the customer value proposition, for example. Elements of the CVP include the offering, access, and payment. So the offering answers the question of what is the consumer buying? So here the idea is you think of these levers and what you can pull to sort of create that offering. Is it a product or service? Is it standard or customized? Is it physical or virtual? And this prompts really good discussions. So you can sort of string together the aspects of the offering that matter most. With access, for example, where do customers actually get your product or service? The same thing holds true here. Is it about mass appeal? What does the support look like? Is it on demand? These are really good questions to ask as you're designing the business model. And the same thing goes here, as you can see, for payment levers. So how will customers actually purchase? Is it pay to own or pay to access? Upfront or after use? Mark mentioned this notion of subscription model. What does that look like? So these are, again, business model levers are a useful tool to kind of think more specifically about the components of a customer value proposition and really think expansively about business model innovation as well. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it back to you for the story of Amazon, and then we'll open it up for some questions. We think this is a good sort of capstone story to bring business model innovation to life a bit more.
Just realized I'm on mute. I will just to close, just before we start into questions, just to mention probably the Apple and Amazon examples are probably the ones that everybody might roll their eyes because they're used, but unfortunately used so often. But unfortunately, if we're talking about a serial business model innovator, there's just no more perfect example than Amazon. And I think Amazon brings together a lot of things that are important to show how serial business model innovation happens. One is Amazon, through Jeff Bezos, has been a visionary company. He has written in his annual reports that looking out to the 7-year horizon gives them a competitive advantage, and that they're not just going to focus on today. That's important to be able to wrap around the process, that process that Erika described, to be able to develop the blueprint of a business model, to test and learn through incubation and then move it to scale. That's not going to be a short-term process, especially if it's driven mostly organically. Apple has gone through the ability to sell books online through a very unique business model to do that, through Amazon Web Services, where everybody thought he was crazy in the mid-2000s, to developing, the Kindle, as hardware. They had never been in hardware before, with its own business model, to getting into digital content and streaming, more recently. So their ability to make all of these major transformational innovations that have been industry transforming, not just for Amazon, have come about by the ability to, one, think in this long-term future back way that I describe and lead from the future, but then also the ability to be able to create the organizational space to develop a process that incubates and develops businesses and business models in the right way that can get them past the core. It's built to transform. That's what we hope with a good language of business model, understanding the circumstances for when you change a business model, and then understanding the process for how you build a business model and incubate it and develop it. That can give you the mindset, the skill set, and the tool set to be able to make this part of your overall innovation agenda and growth agenda, to be able to sustain your organization. And with that, hope that we can entertain some questions here through the chat and Q&A, and we have about 15 minutes to do that. So what do we have here?
Great. Yeah. We've been following the questions here. So Mark, I'll tee up one and we can go from there. So we have one question about risks and assumptions related to business model innovation. So how do we address executives' overconfidence in pursuing new business models? This will help to avoid the issue of not really paying attention to assumptions, and then 2 years later, the idea fails. So any thoughts on that one?
So on risk and assumptions, one of the things I would just say is, especially when you look at the business model canvas, and by the way, I know that that's similar terminology to Alexander Osterwalder, and I'll address that in a minute, as the differences between his kind of 7-box versus sort of the basis of the 4-box. But if you look, regardless of the canvas you're looking at, the whole idea of a business model frame is to really make explicit assumptions. I mean, there's really no other reason for it other than to kind of get behind you don't know what you don't know, to make those unknown unknowns known, and how you identify them. You have a point of view about this is what the business model should look like, the assumptions behind it, and how do you go about testing it. So the idea really is to fill out these design a business model to be able to be explicit on assumptions. And the way that you manage the risk and mitigate it is to make sure to test a little to learn a lot, that these things are incubated in a foothold market. You never start these things too big. The whole Hilti story, even for as much as they had momentum and kind of thinking off of their existing business, they started it in Switzerland in a very, very small customers. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's certainly at least a part of the answer.
Yeah.
So let me just specific on the Q&A. One of the questions from Nathan was, there are other popular business model frameworks like Business Model Canvas, which I believe is Alexander Osterwalder, which have similarities to the four box. What would be the advantage of the four box over others? How would you introduce this model in organizations familiar with language? Well, I do think there's similarities. There's no question about it. There are similarities in the, linking just directly to the part that's core, which is there always needs to be a value proposition to the customer. There always needs to be some way that you're realizing value for yourself, which is typically financial. And then there's got to be a way to describe the organizational system, the set of different functions that have to come together. I mean, there's no other way, you have to start with that foundational piece. I think the differences in the boxes are in the nuance and the emphasis. I've always believed, the first article, the first, sort of representation came out in 2008 with the article that I co-wrote with Clay Christensen called Reinventing Your Business Model in Harvard Business Review, which actually won the McKinsey Award, is I thought that those things were meant to be as simple as possible to be able to focus on what's reflective of each of those areas. So I think the differences are on some things that I feel like the competition question is, in my view, it's not really about the competition is ultimately the customer, like meaning the way the customer needs and job to be done needs to get accomplished, and the gap between how it's being done today versus how you can deliver it with a product or service in support of the business model is what's going to create value and allow you to beat the competition, not to necessarily being thinking about the competition. And then just to add, is there a shift as there is a shift from performance to reliability, convenience to cost, there's an increase of probability of modularity in markets as well. Are these forces separate? That's a good question. Many times in affordable innovation, yes, modularity of the product. I would say modularity in the product more than modularity in the market, although that could apply as well. I think there'll be as often at times no difference per se in the modularity of the market, but being able to have a system product that's being able to be more modular and you can do things more quickly is certainly going to drive convenience and cost. Mm-hmm. So anyway, those are a couple questions on my end. Erika, what questions do you see?
Yeah, that's great. We have a couple more in the chat again about ways to test business models in the market and back to sort of the assumptions and a couple perspectives there. I mean, I think what we find is sort of creating categories of assumptions. There might be assumptions around customers or technology or aspects of go-to-market. That really helps. And then to sort of kind of balance how you go and test those is really important. As I said before, investing a little to learn a lot, and it gets to that executive buy-in that someone had asked about as well. If you start testing and iterating and pivoting the business model and you show advancement and change, that's a huge aspect of demonstration. So I think back to leadership and communication, if you're able to start at least testing the model, show how you're improving it, show the impact, that goes a long way to really getting other folks on board. So just wanted to mention that as well. We have another comment here, Mark, about the nonprofit angle to this and some of the concepts we're talking about. I have a quick comment there and then would love your thoughts as well, Mark. But I think one of the things we found to be very interesting is the notion of jobs to be done is really pervasive across corporate and nonprofit. If you think about stakeholder jobs to be done, multi-stakeholder jobs to be done. So whether you're developing a new product or service or a new solution, we still find it to be a very helpful anchor point. But anything else on your end related to nonprofits, Mark?
Well, one is, just to add would be the profit formula is obviously, it's not so much the profit formula, it's the mission.
Right.
But, to your point about accomplishing the job to be done, that oftentimes to be able to deliver on the mission, you're going to have to be able to, to be able to be effectively figuring out how you're going to deliver value to those people that are in need. Whatever the nonprofit's purpose is, is going to be the measure of fulfilling that purpose. But yet the same thing we often see is going to apply, being able to be able to enter into a new space of service, if you will, that the business model framework can apply, because you are still trying to deliver value. You're trying to create value and deliver value for a constituent. So.
Yeah. Yeah, great. There's another comment here, a question about what are some of the early indicators that the C-suite should watch out for that will inspire a deeper look at the existing model and a potential to reinvent their business model. I'll just name a couple, and then Mark, would love your thoughts here. I think two things that we really focus on in terms of indicators. One is just disruption in the marketplace, which has been very prominent over the past year, as you all are aware. And the second thing is shifting consumer sentiment. So how are the jobs to be done of the customer changing across those functional, emotional, and social dimensions? What does success look like? How has that changed? And this gets back to that future focused approach where we encourage organizations not only to look at the current state, but more importantly, look at where the future is heading so you can sort of design for it. So I would say the third thing is just that future focus that can really help highlight some of these indicators ahead of time. But Mark, any other thoughts from you there?
Well, just maybe one to emphasize, it's a little bit the circumstances for business model change in the core is that when you start to see signals of commoditization, the rate at which that's happening, like in Hilti's market, the sort of the drive in that basis of competition towards convenience and low cost, those are indicators, as you get to the convenience and low cost side, as opposed to performance and reliability, often it's the business model that needs to change to be able to make that happen. The other, just for CEOs, is just in general to look out, and this is more internal, what's your growth gap? Meaning, what do you think 5 to 10 years out your core and adjacent can deliver versus what your financial aspiration is? And if you're honest about it, oftentimes there's a financial and positioning gap. To fill that gap that's beyond what you think core can do going forward and adjacencies, by definition, the white space would be going into new markets, which oftentimes means to be ready to do new business models. So we have found oftentimes identifying that growth gap, the difference between the financial aspiration and what core can deliver over 5 to 10 years, creates the need, the desire to look at the existing business model and how it needs to change to sustain over those 5 to 10 years, but also the need for, by identifying new businesses and business models to fill that growth gap.
Great. Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question here and then some closing remarks. There's a great question here around jobs to be done. And it's one we hear about often, which is how do you implement jobs to be done? Because people often don't understand sort of the importance at the onset. And I'll mention a few quick things here and then pass it to you again, Mark. But we often think about this in three ways. It's sort of the mindset, the skill set, and the toolkit for jobs to be done and any other capability building that you're trying to undertake within an organization. So for jobs to be done, it's, what's the mindset? How do you develop a common language around the customer? Then it's the skill set. How do you actually train folks? And we find that training works, but it's also the demonstration project. So we've worked with lots of companies to say, let's take this from concept to launch and show how jobs actually works in real life. So those are some ways that you can create ambassadors throughout the organization that really understand jobs and are able to take that through other parts of the company. But Mark, any thoughts there on how to sort of implement jobs and some of the things to consider?
No, I think that was well said. I mean, if you build the language, it's a critical piece. And then you have to think about the skill set of the process. This ties to another question that's very much similar, that says the poll showed many have no BMI process. What's the best way to implement this internally or convince management, of which jobs to be done with part of that process? We have found that first of all, the ability to get started on that again starts with language in a small group and being able to create a group that's going to be focused in this area. They can be part of an innovation team but it needs to be carved out in a way that they have the ability to, not be held back by the core and the resources and processes of the core, the rules, norms, and metrics of the core. Because by definition, if you're creating a new business model that's truly transformative, it's going to have different processes, it's going to have different rules, norms, and metrics. And if you have it too tightly close to the core, you're not going to be able to create the new and different that's going to be part of a business model innovation. So I think to convince management, one is, I mentioned earlier, from Lead from the Future, convincing management is that they have their own vision and strategy and long-term view about the growth gap and the opportunities by which they can develop a greater appreciation for how the future is not going to just be further product and service innovation, but to achieve new market growth or to reinvent the core, they're going to need business model innovation. So that would be the first step, is they need to have a shared view and aligned and committed to a long-term vision and strategy. The second is to be aware, like I said, about creating this separate group and understanding that you can start small, you can pull in this whole jobs to be done approach to it. You want to be able to incubate and test and have some small wins. But with the key is that it's an innovation group that is carved out with the support of the leadership team who has this long-term perspective and has this understanding of the growth gap.
Great. So thanks for all these questions. We'll try to respond to these in our kind of follow-up with the recording as well. I think we've gotten to most of them, which is great. And so maybe just given the time, we can just offer some concluding remarks. It's been a pleasure being with all of you during this hour. We hope this has been helpful as you think about, business model innovation for resilience during this time and what that means in your organization. Mark, any comments on your end to conclude here?
Well, no, I think we're right at one. I'll just say again, the same thing, appreciate, like Erika, you said, that everybody joining, we certainly would love to continue the conversation. This is hopefully this is just giving you an appetizer. The meal, I think is over a longer period of conversation. So we'd love to stay in touch. It starts with just building a language, a common language and a common way to frame what is a business model and business model innovation. I hope if nothing else, we've tried to further that language that hopefully you could take to your organization and start the conversation with the right people there.
Great. Yeah, stay tuned. This is the first in a series of BMI webinars that we'll be co-hosting, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.